looking at the student results when they took the math analysis readiness test. So the math analysis readiness test is designed to work with pre-calculus students. And what the committee did, who was working on the modules, was to look specifically at the common misconceptions from the data that students were making in that particular course. And then that becomes then the basis of which modules were written. So in the keynote, Kim talked a little bit about the difference between common misconceptions versus student gaps. So we'll talk about that in more depth and how you can actually see that in your student data later. But I'd like you to recognize that the learning modules are not a full curriculum. They're very targeted lessons looking at misconceptions that commonly appear in student work and addressing those errors. These modules are intended to be independent work for students, and they're aligned to MDTP topics. Again, it's not a full curriculum. It does not follow a full course in any way, but again, geared towards addressing errors that students might have. The topics that are in the modules, if you've given the test before, you probably recognize these acronyms from the different tests that you have given. Not all tests have these 5 topics on them, but particularly in the secondary, these probably all occur. So the linear, you see this in your class reports, are linear situations. Rattle refers to rational expressions and graphs of those functions. PolyQ are polynomials with an emphasis on quadratics, functions and their graphs, and the geometry also includes coordinate geometry. So these are
Pat,
the, yes.
quick question. Are learning modules appropriate for middle school?
Uh, Very limited, in my personal opinion, having taught middle school. I think some of the first lessons could be, and today we're going to take time for you to actually go in and look at the modules so you could make that decision. I think some of the linear equation early lessons are appropriate, but perhaps not the ones for polynomials clearly or functions and graphs. We are also adding a 6th module, working with exponents, and that will be added fairly soon, but as soon as it is vetted. So again, the content in these modules are intended to look at common errors that students have made and then bridge them back to what students need to know before they enter a pre-calculus course. And again, it's starting at, for example, in rational expressions, it starts with pretty basic work with fractions, knowing that what students do with fractions in middle school is what students in high school also need to understand as a foundation skill. In each of the lessons, there are 5 components to each of the lessons. Each lesson starts with an explore component. That explore component starts at a conceptual level with an emphasis on visual representation of some sort, working with number lines, working with graphs, looking at models or manipulatives like algebra tiles. And we start there to establish a context for the mathematics that students need to work with. These modules are not written with the expectation that this is new content. These are written with the expectation that students have had experience with the skills prior, but because they are now having errors, this is intended to kind of return them to the last time that they had success, perhaps, to connect to the more advanced learning. In each lesson, there's a watch this section. In the watch this section, students there are links provided to videos or to Desmos activities or to other models that students can build skills by connecting content to individual techniques. So they would be able to look for patterns, be able to see representations that help them connect to the original idea. The third component in each lesson is try this. These are short problem sets with answers and text to help students understand why the procedures they're being asked to do work. There's paid attention particularly to looking at error analysis because again, we're focusing on misconceptions that students might have, and we'll look at specific examples of this in a few minutes. The problem sets are written with an increasing level of difficulty, and prompts are provided to again address those misconceptions that we saw in the test data. A fourth component is looking at the math connections. Here we ask students to connect concepts to the skills or applications that that the lesson was working towards. Usually these questions are at a higher depth of knowledge level. And the final lesson portion provides a practice section. It's an opportunity for students to practice as well as to kind of self-reflect on where they are with that particular skill at that time. So now we're going to look at just kind of a simplified version of how one of these lessons might be designed. So here, for example, is the explore section where we're asking students to think about addition problems, and we want to start it with the visual of being able to use a number line. Notice that this is a low floor activity, again, for students, but we want students to consider different strategies that they might use to find these sums, how many ways. We want to ask them if there are other ways to be able to look at doing these particular sums, and then we want to encourage them to visualize it and use the number line. Then in the watch this section of the lesson, there's a video that is shared with students where they work with equivalent fractions on a number line, knowing that students, in order to add and subtract fractions and decimals, they need to use common units. So we go back to the underlying pre-skill of understanding how to write and look at equivalent fractions, paying attention to the fact that the scales have to have a common denominator for them to be able to do that. The try this section gives students some quick, short problem sets so that we can then check for understanding. Notice that students are asked to use the number line to prove which of these fractions are equivalent. Again, we're hoping to tie the visual to the skill that students are using. And in the making connections, this is where we want students to look at the visual that they've had in the prior problems, being able to use the number line, and then look and tie that back to the algorithm that they've already learned, but hopefully now they can see the most common error is recognizing that you need a common denominator. And we hope that using the number line gives them a visual so they will not write the response of 5/7, for example. So the expectation is that focusing on an error that is commonly made, we can have a visual that will at least make students pause and think as they answer that problem in the future. And then we include problems then where students are going to practice, again, encouraging them to use number lines to add and subtract so that they have some recognition of a visual that goes along with the algorithm they've learned. So at this time, what I'd like to do is take a look. We're going to give you a chance to look at some of the modules just briefly. Again, recognize that the modules that we have currently are those 5 that you see on the screen there. So linear stands for linear situations, rattle stands for rationals, polyq is polynomials and quadratics, geometry, finger is functions and their graphs. And as I mentioned earlier, exponents are coming soon, but they're not released just yet. Now, originally, again, these modules were designed to look at common errors, particularly for students originally based on a pre-calculus test. But when you look at the topics that are in an Algebra 1 or Integrated 1 readiness test, for example, Notice there are more topics clearly on this test than we have modules. So there's not a one-to-one mapping. We hope to continue to write modules that will help support students, but recognize that as you look at your test, some of these have modules available and some do not. So what I'd like to do now is Julie is going to share with you in the chat the link to the module site. We're going to take 4 to 5 minutes for you to be in the site. What I'm going to suggest that you do is take a look perhaps at the linear module. Look at the linear module, look at module 1, the first lesson, so you can take a look at the structure of a typical module. So Julie, if you could go ahead and share that link now.
Okay, I just did.
Thank you.
Anybody has any
And
problems, just,
yep, we're here. And actually, if you want to turn on your mics even to ask questions, please feel free to do so. So we're going to take about 4 to 5 minutes here so you can explore one of the modules, any of the modules that you'd like.
Hello?
Hi, Gail.
Hi, I am I the only one who's present?
No, I think there's some others here. Not seeing the screen. There we go. Yeah, no, there's several of us here. Welcome.
Okay. So I'll just mute myself and listen then, huh?
Oh, at this time, Julie has shared a link in the chat. If you if you click on that link, that will take you to the modules website. So we're going to take 4 or 5 minutes here so you can take a look at the modules that we now have posted there.
Okay, and I see Julie Mustard, but I do not see a link.
It should be in the chat.
Yes, I'm in the chat.
okay, I'll do it again. I think maybe it might have come before you joined in. Let me
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Julie.
Oh, sure.
Oops.
Okay, do you see that now?
I do. I'll click on it. Thank you, lady.
Good.
You're welcome. And just feel free. I'm going to put my email address again in too. If there's anything you need, just reach out to me.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm to be reading this, and at some point I'll be linked in with the next session.
With the next slide, correct.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
If the technology works, yes.
That's all. Isn't that ever the question?
You just have to hold your breath each
Exactly. And I'm willing to do that because I understand.
time.
I'm going to go back and mute myself so that the
That's fine.
noise here, let's see, how do I get out of here? I'm going to remove myself here, mute myself, and then go back. Okay.
Okay, about one more minute. Okay, about 30 seconds. All right, so you've had a chance now to look briefly at some of the modules that are there. Now, these modules are at our website. They're not password protected. Students, parents, anyone can access these simply at our website. You don't need any protection there. Teachers can have access to these. So this gives you an idea of what we have available. So if you'll return to the slideshow, I can return to the slideshow. There we go. What we want to do now is take a moment and look at how you can use your own class MDTP data to know when you can link to the modules themselves. So if you have given the MDTP test before, one of the pages that I found as a teacher to be most helpful was the item analysis page or the item analysis tab. So when you get your class report back from MDTP, particularly if you have done online testing, the item analysis tab itself, and Kim referred to this a little bit in the opening session this morning, the item analysis tab helps you identify the strengths, unfinished learning, and gaps. So pretty obviously, the strengths would be where most students have answered correctly. So you can make that decision about what's a particular classroom strength by looking at the item analysis page that lists every item on the test. And as you scan the ABCD options on the right-hand side of that report, you can pick out those items where most students have answered correctly. What we want to focus on in looking at the modules in particular is when students have some unfinished learning. And in looking at the unfinished learning, there's two categories that we've looked at in defining that when students have a misconception versus when students are doing informed guessing. And in working with the modules, we want to look particularly at where students demonstrate misconceptions. And I think as a teacher, that is the most concerning thing for me, because for a misconception, and this is the important idea here, is that this is when a large percent of your students choose one incorrect option. And as a teacher, that's the scariest part, because students believe they're right. A majority of students have chosen an option that is clearly the wrong answer. And so this is something that you need to address in your class so that those misconceptions can be dealt with. And we're going to take a look at it in a minute of how you can see that in the student responses. The guessing section, in order to make a judgment whether kids are just guessing, is again looking at your analysis tab. And if you see an item where all options were kind of chosen evenly, then that tells you that students really weren't quite sure. They have some familiarity with the technique or with the procedure or the skill that's being asked for, but they're really not sure, and they were just kind of picking their best guess. Now, in order to get results that can be used formatively, it's really important before students take the test that they understand that you're giving this as a diagnostic. As Kim mentioned earlier in the presentation that she did, is that we want students to not guess. You need to make it clear to students that this is a diagnostic. It's going to help you in your lesson planning and in your creating activities for students, that you want to know what students are unclear of, what things they are not sure of, as well as looking at those items that they don't need 100% confidence in their responses, but if they have some familiarity, they should answer the questions. There is an explicit direction that for my students, I would repeat a couple of days before they took the test, the day of the test, it shows up on the screen on the test. And the line says, for you and your teacher to make the best use of this data, you should not guess. You know, if you have an idea of what the correct answer might be, click on it, fill it in. But don't just randomly make a pattern. If you're doing paper testing, students would do all the B's. No, don't do that. That's really not helpful. And for students to feel that confidence and to trust what you're saying, these were never used as graded items. To me, this is a formative assessment idea that we want students to recognize. It's a tool to help you as a teacher in your planning. So let's take a look now at how you can identify those particular misconceptions. So as we look at an item, now again, if you're giving the test online, you can see this data, your data from your classes very nicely. This is from the Algebra Math 1 readiness test. This is a class of 9th graders in the fall. Was about 250 students as a cohort in Northern California. So notice that clearly item B is the correct choice. This would be considered a strength, in my opinion, but is it something that I'm going to say, oh, good enough, 60%? No. As I look at the 60%, there's still 40% of the class who really struggled with this question. Also, I want to note at the bottom that only 1% of the class omitted it. So they have some confidence in their work with fractions, clearly in this class. However, they still have errors. So to me as a teacher, even though this is a strength, this is a key to me that I want to design some type of activity where these 60% of the students are going to be sharing their reasoning with the other 40%. So this is something that I want to do to have discourse with the students. I might develop a parallel problem and students can talk about it in teams. I want to ensure that those 60% are spread throughout the teams or spread throughout their partners so that they, again, can explain their reasoning, whether it be with a number line or with a drawing, so that they can, again, address that situation. And then I chose another item to take a look at. And this is question 31 from a geometry readiness test. And again, the first problem dealt with the idea of working with fractions. We have fraction items on all of our tests from 6th grade through calculus. So as teachers, you know that that's a topic that need to be addressed repeatedly. But now the same type of fraction problem, if you look again at your student results here, this to me would be clearly a misconception. When you scan the options on your class report, notice that 60% of the students chose the incorrect option. So since there's only a few of us here, you don't really need to use the chat at this point, but what would that item B tell you about what misconceptions students have? And if you want to unmute and just share, please feel free to do so. What does item B tell you about your students' understanding?
They don't know about getting a common denominator.
Yes. And what did they do?
They added the numerators and added the denominators.
Ever seen that one as a teacher? Right. So this to me, again, as a teacher, is something that I would want to address in class. And again, it could be with just creating a parallel problem. This would be a classic activity for my favorite no, where again, you would want to bring students back to looking at that idea of working with a common denominator. Again, with maybe working with the number line, working with the concept with numeric values in the denominator. But recognize again, students felt confidence. Only 1% of the students omitted the problem. So again, they thought they knew what they were doing. So this is something that you can tell from your class data if this is a skill that you need to spend some time with. So we are working on mapping these items, taking a look at the individual tests. So for example, based on the examples you just saw, this is the first example we saw was question number 9 on the Algebra Math 1 readiness test. Question 31 came from the geometry readiness test. And so we are mapping the individual items back to which modules would be appropriate to work with that particular skill. Now, again, we don't have modules for every single skill, but we are trying to map where those most common errors map back into a module. Julie can share this document with you. This is several pages long because we have the traditional pathway of algebra, geometry, and geometry readiness, second year algebra readiness. We also have a second page, third page, where their integrated classes are also mapped back. This particular mapping document is not currently on our website. We're still vetting and error checking, but it will be posted on our website under the modules link, probably in the next week or so. So those are available for teachers that want to be able to map so that you don't have to kind of track things back and forth. Then if this is something that you're intrigued with, we've also created a worksheet that you could use in your PLC. Julie can go ahead and share this link for this worksheet. Our time this morning is, we're right on time, but this is somewhat limited this morning, but this might be a good PLC activity where you and your department could look at a particular test, a particular item, like we just looked at. What would be clearly a misconception that your students might have, explain what that error is, look at the strategies students might have used incorrectly, and then look at the module and see if that does address that particular error. And then you can decide to assign that to your students. And if not, what additional re-engagement is needed so that you can come back to that idea. So this is something, again, that you could do with your staff or might help you kind of track that process if you're interested. We're pretty much on track right now time-wise, but if you have questions, we're going to leave the module section at this point. If you want to jot down some questions, we are going to have a Q&A time maybe at the end of this hour. If not, we're coming back at 11:15 this morning to take time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions at this point, just go ahead and write those down. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second part of this presentation. So as we look at resources that MDTP has to offer teachers, one was the modules, which are fairly new. Another resource that we have that's been around for quite a while but isn't used necessarily very often are the written response items. I have used these in my class for quite some time, and I love these problems. These are single topic problems. So again, once you look at your class data, if you see, for example, that your students need work with rationals, there are items that focus just in a more narrow way on just that particular topic. These are intended, as Kim mentioned earlier, to elicit student thinking. I loved these problems because of the class discussions. And again, a little harder during COVID time, maybe to get those discussions going, but they really do trigger conversations and discourse in the class where students really need to be able to explain their thinking. So let's take a look at an example of one of these problems. We're going to look now at the problem AR12 lapse. The topic that it's categorized in is proportional reasoning. However, I would also add rational numbers because there's a lot of number operations in this problem itself. It's probably appropriate for middle school and entry-level high school who need work with proportional reasoning, perhaps, and fractions. So Julie's going to share the link to the item in the chat. We're going to take 3 or 4 minutes for you to look at that item. I'm going to ask you to look at it as a teacher and anticipate ways in which students might respond to the prompt. And then also think about your students now and think about if you have students in your class now that might benefit from this particular item. So we're going to spend 3 or 4 minutes here for you to look at the item itself. You might make some notes on your paper of how you would see students responding to this. So Julie, if you could share that in the chat, all good?
Yes, I'll share it.
Oh, good.
Everybody see it? Okay.
All right, about 1 more minute. About 30 seconds. All right, at this time, if I could interrupt you and have you return to the slideshow a little bit, and we can talk a little bit now about what else comes with the problems. So if your students are unfamiliar with rubric rating, the introduction to the problem is important. You want to be sure that these instructions at the top of the page are clear to your students, that for your student, in order to be able to understand their thinking, your work should clearly show how you solved each part, label any figures that you draw. When these items are released, as Kim mentioned early, we field test everything before we release anything to look at what typical student responses there are. So we change the language in the problem if we find that students are not giving us enough information about their thinking. So we look carefully at that logic. Another quick note about the written response items and our written tests. We write these items with the expectation that students are not using a calculator. Again, depending on the level of the school and what your objective is, but that's a decision that you can make as a teacher. For me, I've used this item. I want students to have fluency between their fractions and decimals. So this is a problem I would choose and ask students to do without their calculators. So we try to make the numbers reasonable to work with. I would use this in a 7th grade class or an 8th grade class, perhaps. 9th graders, if we need to review a little bit with fluency, recognizing the idea that these are proportional situations. So recognize that that is some consideration that you should do these items before you give them to your kids to know what parameters you want to give them as they work on the problems themselves. So besides having a problem available for students to work with, each problem comes with an essence statement. The essence statement is written to let you know what the author's intentions were when we first wrote this item. In the essence statement, we also show you multiple ways that students might approach the problem. One of the things I always encouraged my kids to do was to find alternative ways, look at different strategies. And that is something that again leads to great classroom discussion when students approach the problem in different ways. And in each essence statement, there is also a possible extension. So if you have students who are looking to push themselves a little further, you have a class that's ready to go a little further, those are available in each of the problem's essence statement. There is a general scoring rubric that is important, I think, to share with students before they do the item so that they recognize that to get an excellent, it has to be complete as well as correct and clearly stated. Notice that they can still have, again, a good score, but just recognize that some omissions, some errors, but it's at least well developed and presented. So students know again that you are looking for responses and those responses need to be in written form. Then besides the general rubric, each question also has a specific rubric. These specific rubrics are based on what we see in student work. So notice that there's keys here that what would be considered a partial response for students, what would be a partial response for D. Again, that would mean it's not correct, but it gives you some ideas based on what we have seen in student work. What are some key things to look for? So once you've decided if you are going to use the written responses with students, and again, I would encourage you to do so because they really provide some great discussions. So if you have not used rubric scoring before with your students, be sure that you solve it as a teacher so students know what your expectations are to show a score of a 4. Some options for using these. You can use this as a teacher scoring option. This is the way I have used it before. And that is, I could score it, the student work as it is. Then I share the specific rubric with students. So they have a chance to make revisions based on knowing that they had maybe they had a complete section for A, but B is incomplete. They hadn't explained their reasoning clear enough. So you can give it back to them to revise, kind of the idea that this is a draft thinking that you could use with students. Some other teachers have used this before where students score their own papers using the specific rubric. I have not used it that way, but know that this certainly would be an option that you could use as you work with these items. Okay, what we're going to do next, and we have some time left still. Julie's going to share this site. Now, these written response items are not posted on our website. They are protected in only teachers should have access to these items because we don't want tutors and parents, practicing these things ahead of time with students. So because you are all registered for this session, you're already vetted as a teacher, That's why we're able to share this link with you now. If at a later time, or there are other teachers you know of who would like access to this website, all you have to do is go to mdtp.ucsd request access. Someone in our San Diego office will then send that teacher a link as long as they have a school email. So again, this is a protected part of our website. So what I'm going to do now, again, is give you 5 minutes to explore the site. I'm going to suggest, well, as you get to the website, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a tab that says items by topic. I'm going to suggest, as you look at the items by topic, scroll through a topic that you might have interest in as a topic and click on the item to see the full written response item. So that way you can see the essence statement, the rubric that is all included. Notice that you can look at the problem only if you want, or you can look at the full package. So let's just take maybe 3 minutes here for you to look at this site and know how you can maneuver around the site. So Julie, share the link.
Shared. All
Thank
good.
you. Okay, about 1 more minute. And if you're seeing things you like here, you might want to bookmark this site and you can come back to it later and not have to get revetted. About 30 seconds. All right, if you could pause wherever you are and return to the slideshow. Now, when you were in the site, again, notice that you had both a name and a topic to help you kind of filter through what sorts of problems are available. There's a column here that is titled Suggested Course. I will talk a little bit further about what these little asterisks are referring to, but you can see where for perhaps at a certain grade level, this could be a low floor problem, or at another grade level, it might be a little above. So again, I personally would suggest, I know in my department, we would have conversations as we looked at these items of where we thought this would best fit in our department where it would look. So we could kind of articulate between us so kids weren't seeing the same problem 3 years in a row. Though curiously enough, very few of them ever remember seeing certain problems from year to year. We always think as a math teacher, oh, this is meaningful. Well, maybe not so much, but it's worth having a conversation about perhaps. The module link, I think, again, would I use this module with fifth graders? Probably not. So again, as a junior high teacher, I taught at a 7, 8, 9 school. I can't say that I use the modules at a 7, 8, 9 level. It has some potential, but I do find that the items in particular were very rich for my own classroom. So let's talk a little bit about the meaning of these asterisks and ways that you might be able to look at using these. The single asterisk is the idea that it's an introducing idea, concept that you're working with your students. You perhaps use this when students are first learning the content, so that would begin earlier grade, and you could use this to have them explore different strategies, perhaps in a way that's a little more guided. You could also use these items perhaps at an advancing level, and meaning that students have already been in the context of whatever the math topic is, they're advancing their knowledge, and perhaps they could look at multiple ways to solve the certain problem. So that takes kind of a different meaning to what you're looking for in their work and how you discuss the problem with your students. And then these could also be used as re-engagement items. And I think in these COVID years, this might be a really good use. So if you have students, for example, in your geometry or integrated 2 class that clearly need help with fractions, it's a misconception that you saw in your data, you can use one of the fraction topic problems, for example, that was maybe recommended for 7th grade or 8th grade to access or activate their prior knowledge. Because I think in the disruption that they've had perhaps in their education, these problems would be ideal to, again, trigger some knowledge that they have in order to move it forward. So working with fraction problems that actually have rational numbers in the denominators, knowing they're going to be working with rational expressions in the denominators. Another way that you could use these problems is, as we talked about earlier, if you've identified there's a particular misconception that your class has, then this could be one of the intervention activities, for example, that you would do with your students. So that way you can address that misconception specifically. Now, as a teacher, you again have to think about how that fits your lessons. So again, we're just going to give you some quick ideas here in how you might use these. So if your students are at an introductory level, have them solve it independently, look at their progress, maybe choose a few students to present their method. So either you, in whatever way you can, depending on whether your class is remote or in person. So if you're doing this as an introductory method, you might want to purposely align who's presenting to build whatever ideas you want into your lesson. Again, we would encourage you to do the problem yourself before you give it to your kids, so you can anticipate what questions and you can anticipate what errors you expect to see so that you can prepare questions to move them forward. And then you can also use it to provide feedback to students using the rubric. So that's kind of at an introductory level. If students are at a more advanced level, you might give the item to the students and ask them to work collaboratively to solve the problem as a team. Then that's forcing students to justify, argument, debate on one particular solution, how they can best show that solution on their paper. You could have your students then do a poster walk with that particular written item. You can chart what methods they used, maybe give them a class name or a person's name who showed a novel way of approaching the problem. And then you can use then again for students who are a little more advanced in their skills to have them debate what method they found helpful, with the idea in particular of looking at how you can address those particular misconceptions that you saw earlier, specifically in that conversation. And then again, looking at re-engaging students who, again, these are not items to teach a skill, but those students who need to access prior learning, these could be used at a level to re-engage students into things, into looking at topics that they've seen in the past, but need to move student learning forward. Again, kind of similar to what we did with the prior level, but recognizing that being able to anticipate student responses and connect those to whatever their current learning is. So again, if they're looking at fractions, just as an example, being able to connect to that idea of a common denominator. We're going to skip through this idea because we're just about done. Let's move to the next slide. Now, last thing is, in order for us to release these items, we need teachers who will field test the items. So we have another Google site, and Julie, if you would share this. These are field tests. These are items that were written by teachers over the summer, but we need student work in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the items. So if you are interested in using some of these newer items, this is the Google site where you can download these particular items. It looks just like the other, but notice that it's field tests. So these have not been vetted yet. We've not had a chance to edit them based on student work. But if you use these for field test items, please send us your scored and scanned results for one class. So again, the student name is not important, but being sure that your score is here on the papers that you scan helps our writers evaluate the effectiveness. And we would really appreciate teachers' help in getting some student work. Very briefly, I didn't choose these papers. Someone else found somebody who was very rich in their responses, but this is kind of the ideas, the kind of way the student work potentially could be responded to. So, but I would tell you as a teacher that encouraging kids to use diagrams, and be explicit about what they used. This would be my model number 4. This could also be a model number 4. Again, where students took a different approach. Probably they used calculators, and again, that would be a teacher choice to use there. So just a brief reminder, and again, I think Kim did this in the intro, All of the things that we offer, because we are funded by grants through the UC, these items are all free to you. The workshops and training is also free to you. And on our last page, with 1 minute to spare, here's a list of resources. And notice that most of it can be just accessed at mdtp.ucsd.edu. My email is there at the bottom of the page if you would like to contact me, or Julie is her contact. She could probably share in the chat also. So I thank you for your attention, and cheers for getting up on a Saturday morning and sharing your time with us. So if you have any questions, this is intended to be a 15-minute break. If you could jot down your questions and bring them back at 11:15, you have a link, I believe, for the Q&A time. So I will stay on for another 5 minutes if you have any quick questions you'd like me to answer. Otherwise, we'll see you back at a different Zoom room at 11:15. And thank you.